Hello, and welcome to a brand new Iceberg series. Much has been said in the comment section about my southern accent. Oddly, most of you all seem to enjoy it, although I did have a few negative comments that absolutely hated it, while a couple accused me of faking it, which I found bizarre, because if anything, before I started this channel, I was Googling ways to get rid of my accent. When I seen how long that would take, I just said whatever and started the channel. Anyways, since there's been so many comments about it, I thought, why not make a southern mystery iceberg? And I can hear some of you saying now, but insomnia, I'm not southern. And to that I say, even better. Because that means the vast majority of these mysteries I'm bringing to you are going to be obscure. And what do we love on this channel? The obscure ones. We've all heard about Jack the Ripper. Tell me about the Night Marauder. We all know about Sasquatch. Tell me about the Beast of LBL. I have worked on this for a few months, and I hope you all will enjoy it. The Iceberg is somewhat modeled on the Unsolved Mysteries Mega Iceberg series that I have covered. Except on mine, I only have 6 categories: Unsolved Murders, Missing Persons, Paranormal, Cryptozoology, Unidentified People, and Other, which is going to be kinda like the wild card category. Every mystery on here comes from the US South, from one of 12 states or 2 commonwealths. These regions are the ones I finally settled on after looking at various sources to find them what is and what isn't southern. I mean, I think there's a general consensus, but there's a few states that are kinda on the outside of what I would generally consider southern. Like for instance, Maryland, who I chose to leave off, in spite of some sources saying that they are southern. But to me, they just feel northeastern. The locations I did choose are as follows: Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, which, fun fact, Florida is the only state where the further north you go, the further south you get, Georgia, the Commonwealth of Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, Missouri, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, the Commonwealth of Virginia, and West Virginia. Finally, the best part of this being an iceberg created by me, well, it's the fact that I can change any of the mysteries at any time. So if I come across a more interesting one, I can easily change it out. So with all that out of the way, let's dive on in. Swift's Silver Mine, Kentucky. In 1788, a man named John Filson, who was an early historian of Kentucky, as well as being one of the original founders of Cincinnati, would record something rather curious. Filson would write that in the Appalachian Mountains of eastern Kentucky lie a silver mine that a man named John Swift had discovered in the year of 1760, 9 years before famed explorer Daniel Boone's expedition into Kentucky. And although Europeans had seen part of Kentucky before Boone, it was still largely unexplored, making Filson's claim of a silver mine in East Kentucky almost a decade before Boone seem, well, unthinkable. And John Filson being a historian and scholar, well, he wouldn't lie about it, right? Unfortunately, shortly after Filson recorded this knowledge, he would vanish while surveying the Great Miami River in Ohio after his party was attacked by Shawnee Indians, so he was never able to expand upon what exactly he knew about the location of the silver mine. What is known has been added onto over the years, leading to a legend where some of the facts have obviously been embellished. But the basic story goes like this. An Englishman by the name Jonathan Swift had went into the region of eastern Kentucky 9 years before Boone in 1760 on a series of mining expeditions. Over this time frame, Swift would keep a journal. In that journal, he would claim that a wounded bear had actually led him to the vein of silver ore in a cave, and for the next 9 years, he would make annual treks back to the site of the mine, carrying out silver bars and minted coins. Over the years, Swift would start to hit more and more obstacles every time he went back into the hills for his silver. There was always the threat of Indian attacks, which he had already survived a couple, and then his crew would actually mutiny at one point. Swift had enough, and he would actually wall up the cave and discontinued his mining operation in 1769, just months before Daniel Boone would make his way into Kentucky. Now, as I just mentioned, the story from here gets added onto and gets variations. One account, even published in Harper's Magazine over a century later in 1886, claimed that Swift had buried a good deal of the treasure in various locations. Most people completely disregard this and instead focus on the location and legitimacy of the silver mine itself. And if it does exist, where is this mine? Well, we do know that one respected historian named John Haywood, who is known as the father of Tennessee history, would record finding 2 ancient furnaces near Clear Creek in the far southeastern corner of Kentucky in Bell County that he believed may have been used by Swift to smelt the silver down. And according to Swift's journal, he and his crew got the silver in a cave just 3 miles from where these furnaces were. So, if it is real, this is the most likely area cited by searchers, although other areas of eastern Kentucky have been proposed. After this, the journal would state that due to increasing hostility from the Indians, they would decide to leave, so Swift left his journal with a widow named Miss Renfro, whom he was romantically interested in. Then the crew would board a canoe on the Cumberland River and head to a place now called Nashville. His crew would vanish from record after this, but Swift would return the following year. But before he could return, a disease had rendered him almost blind, and he was never able to find his mine or treasures again. Yet, most skeptics claim that this mine probably never existed, citing that in the 2 centuries since, not one bit of mining and excavation in the region has yielded one single vein of silver ore. There's also the issue of the journal, which there are numerous versions of that the story is based on. So if it doesn't exist, how did this story get started? Well, it seems that the first person to write about it, John Filson, wasn't the most honest guy, as he had gotten into trouble previously, trying to run a scam with some land claim type of deal. It's thought that he made the whole thing up in order to get people moving into the area, where he would then try to pull a similar scam again. This has not deterred treasure hunters though, who still believe the mine exists. Kreneice Jones and LaMoine Allen, Mississippi. On May 10th, 1992, 3-year-old Kreneice Jones would attend Mother's Day church service and dinner with her father in a town called Woodville, Mississippi. They actually lived in Edgar, Louisiana though, which was over 100 miles away, but they were visiting the Allen family, whom Kreneice's father was close to. Now before I get too deep into this, I want to point out there's a lot of conflicting info ahead, which creates some confusion. For example, some accounts claim that it was Kreneice's mother who took her, not her father. Regardless, I will try to simplify it. At some point that evening, Kreneice and her father would go about 4 miles east of Woodville to a store called Jimmy Jackson Grocery Store. This grocery store was owned by the Allen family, who also owned 8 homes around it. As mentioned, the Allen family were close to the Jones family, and on that day, 2-year-old LaMoine Allen had tagged along. Allen actually lived with his aunt and uncle because his father was in the military and his mother was attending school out of town. We also know that Kreneice's mother was actually dating one of LaMoine's uncles. In spite of this, the 2 small children had barely been around each other. The adults would actually go to the house on the left of the store to have a barbecue and listen to music, while the children went to the home on the right to play. And around 4 p.m., the children simply vanished. The adults would start going door to door looking for them, while the police came out with search dogs. Detectives would quickly claim that the children had been taken by a vehicle that had been spotted in front of the store. This vehicle was a blue compact car with a false convertible top, chrome hubcaps, and dark tinted windows. But I have to emphasize, it's not 100% sure that this car was involved. It is possible that it just happened to be in the area around the time. In fact, Kreneice's family believes that description of the car was made up in an attempt to implicate someone else in their family, and that no such vehicle ever passed by. One weird thing about this case is the fact that there were 20 adults around, but no one seemed to be watching the kids. I think that might be because it was one of those deals where everyone else thought someone else was watching them, plus the fact that they were in a rural area, which made them feel safer. There's not a lot of details on this one, so there's not a lot of theories. One is abduction by someone outside the family. There's also the theory, of course, that someone from inside the family was behind it, or that an accident was covered up, or even that the kids just got lost in the woods and succumbed to the elements. One other thing I have seen thrown around is that these kids did not just hang out by the store. Instead, it's alleged that they went to tag along with some much older kids that they didn't really know. Apparently, at some point, these kids asked Kreneice and LaMoine to stop following them. One girl named Tasha specifically had taken Kreneice with her and then never brought her back. However, because the record keeping on this is pretty poor, I can't verify that obviously. But the last official sighting of the children came from a woman that had drove by and seen the two children playing next to the highway. After that, it's anyone's guess. Valley Hill Lights, Kentucky. In 1995, in a little community called Valley Hill, near Springfield, Kentucky, would become the center of a very weird and religious phenomenon. According to the data I could find online, the first person to actually witness this was the owner of Valley Hill, a woman named Iona Wright, as she would claim to have seen visions of the Virgin Mary, along with random bursts of color and showers of golden flakes. Thousands of people, especially of the spiritual type, have flocked to the area since, and several have been interviewed to talk about their experiences. They claim to have seen several things in the sky, including strange dots and visions. Some have claimed to have seen others with gold on their faces. Another stated that as she held her rosary, it turned to gold. She also smelled roses, but none were around. And one of the most well-documented cases came on April 6, 1995, when a Sunday school teacher, Ann Mudd, and her 8 students visited Valley Hill. One of the students, a girl named Mandy Mattingly, claimed to have seen strange colors around the sun, and right after all of this, the other girls would see them too. The teacher, Ann, would even take pictures, and in one of the pictures, it was claimed that you could see angels around a girl. Another picture showed what was claimed to be Jesus and the Virgin Mary with a veil. One of the girls also claimed that another picture had a tombstone with the name Kate Ballard on it, who was the girl's deceased cousin. The mothers of these girls would obviously be skeptical at first, but even they got sucked into it after having several visions of their own. In fact, that would be a reoccurring theme, where several skeptics would go out to investigate, only to become believers themselves after having their own visions. And to the believers of this phenomenon, it still hasn't been explained to this day. However, others disagree. A man from the Skeptical Inquirer, named Dr. Joe Nickel, investigated the pictures and said the photos were nothing more than bad pictures developed from a cartridge leak, and that the visions of Jesus and Mary was just due to pareidolia, which is the brain's tendency to perceive a specific meaningful image in random patterns, and the tombstone with the written name on it was actually from the writing on a chart on the back of the Polaroid photo pack. He attributed everything else to mass hysteria. However, the crowds would continue to grow for a time, but in the following years, they diminished, and now maybe 1 to 2 people visit occasionally. But from what I could find from recent interviews, recent being the early 2000s, the girls from the Sunday school class still believe they witnessed the miracle that day. Barbara Blount, Louisiana. 58-year-old widow, Barbara Blount, of Livingston Parish, Louisiana, lived alone, but kept in regular touch with her relatives. In fact, her 2 children lived just down the road, and she made dinner for them every day, as well as often taking her sister to medical appointments. She lived a quiet life, but she was active in her local church. And on May 2, 2008, at 11:30 a.m., Barbara was cleaning out her kitchen cabinets. And we know this because her neighbor was on the phone with her at the time. It's actually this neighbor who would be the last person to ever speak to Barbara, that we know of at least. When her daughter could not get a hold of her at noon, she asked her cousin to pop in and check on her. He lived close by, so he went to check out the house and was kind of surprised to see the front door cracked open, as well as the windows. He would walk in and saw Barbara's phone lying out on the floor with the battery pulled out. The pots had been removed for cleaning, were still stacked on the kitchen floor. The police were called immediately. They found no sign of forced entry, and there were no valuables missing. The FBI would eventually be called in, and they didn't find anything either. The sheriff would later remark that it was the cleanest crime scene that they had ever seen. By that evening at 4:15 p.m., her 2006 silver Toyota Camry would be found parked about a quarter of a mile from her home. It was actually parked on a dirt logging road on the property of a hunting club. It had been set about 25 to 30 yards off the road and was hidden behind some trees. There was also water in the floorboard, That's probably from a heavy rain that hit the area earlier, the same rain that hampered much of the early search. The keys were found buried under gravel about 20 yards from her car. The police were obviously called, and again, they searched the area. Detectives did find one early lead, and that was a witness who seen a woman matching Barbara's description standing outside of that car, wearing a tank top, pinstripe shorts, and purple Crocs, and holding her keys and possibly glasses. They also seen a white man in a late 90s model, big silver Ford pickup truck parked near her car, and Barbara was standing at his driver's door talking to him. The witness stated that although Barbara turned to them and smiled as they went by, something seemed off. The man was wearing mirrored sunglasses, had light-colored blonde hair or bleached hair, with dark roots, almost in a bowl cut. He was thin and his face was kind of sunken in. He sort of looked unhealthy. The man would turn away like he didn't want to be seen. These witnesses described Barbara correctly, going by what she was wearing that day, and they also picked her out of a photo lineup, yet could not pick the man out of a lineup when police provided pictures of who they thought it might be. This man is obviously the key, considering he never came forward. This case was only made more odd by the fact that Barbara was particularly cautious. She wouldn't open her door for strangers, and she also carried a gun when going outside, even when just going to milk the cows. That handgun would be found left in the home. Another key part that sticks out in this: Barbara's house could not even be seen from the road, meaning that the person almost certainly didn't just stumble across it. They knew it was there, and that she lived alone, meaning she probably knew the person. Detectives have pretty much ruled out robbery, since nothing was taken, and her credit cards were never used, but they do believe she was taken forcefully. There has been one pretty crazy theory that has popped up in all of this, that being, it's actually tied to the death of her husband back in 2004, because apparently, the now deceased Henry Blount had perished when he was driving a gasoline tanker truck over some railroad tracks and was tragically struck by a train. The crash not only killed Henry though, but also 2 railroad employees. The locomotive union was furious and blamed the crash on Henry. Some members of the union even claimed that their co-workers had been murdered. Some speculate that this was some kind of payback to the Blount family for that, although it's kind of weird they waited 4 years to get their revenge. There's also claims of this being a payback for a drug debt, as it's rumored someone in her family was involved in the drug trade. The sheriff, for his part, has been pretty proactive, going on various podcasts to talk about the case, as well as asking the community to provide info if they have it. He claimed they have suspects, but within the past few years, he has admitted the case stands where it did the day it happened. Even DNA found in her car led to nothing. Mont Highley IV, Alabama. Mont Highley IV was raised in Montgomery, Alabama, and actually attended the University of Alabama. After he graduated, he would begin working in the construction field, traveling a lot, but always coming back to his home in Montgomery to spend time with his friends and family. And it's that home that this mystery would begin, when on Thanksgiving 2003, he would go to have dinner with his family. At this dinner, he would actually make plans with his father, Dr. Mont Highley III, to go hunting just 2 days later on Saturday. Mont would actually stay on Thanksgiving and left the following evening on Friday, intending to come back Saturday morning to the farm to go hunting with his dad. But that Saturday morning, Dr. Highley would arrive and did not see Mont nor his Tahoe, which was odd considering the farm was unlocked and the front door to the mobile home stood open. The lights and the TV were also on inside the home. Dr. Highley would assume that Mont had decided to just go watch the football game with friends, so he locked up and went home. His father would state later on that they had talked briefly the evening before, and that Mont told his father he was going to go hunting alone between 5 to 5:30 p.m., but he would still see him the next day, before the call was abruptly cut off. About an hour later, Mont was spotted at a liquor store, where he bought some beer and called a friend to go hunting, but the friend couldn't make it. Then, between 8 and 9:35 p.m., phone records showed that Mont had been on a few phone calls. The following day, though, Dr. Highley would receive a call from an attorney and former judge, Dale Segrist, who told him that Mont's Tahoe was parked on their property. They at first didn't know until they checked inside and they seen his son's wallet, but they didn't think much of it, since they had known the Highley family for a while and knew that they had a camp nearby. Mont was nowhere to be seen though. When the police arrived to help search, they found it complicated by the fact that multiple locations were involved, and there was no sign of a struggle. A few of Mont's belongings were strewn about the 290-acre family farm. His boots were on the front porch, his wet pants in the bedroom, with a cell phone and $100 in the pocket. The family golf cart was found abandoned a little further out from the mobile home, stuck on a tree root, with Mont's shirt, a pistol, and random items about. In his truck was the keys, wallet with the cash, and a rifle inside. Tracking dogs followed his scent from the Segras family property to across the road where they finally lost it. And just 2 months later, on January 14th, someone linked to the Johnson property reported a body in an unused grain silo behind a restaurant. Because of the decomposition, he was left to dental records, which confirmed that it was Mont, and here we come across the first area of mixed reports. Some volunteers claimed to have searched that area early on, and Mont was not found, while the Alabama SBI claims that law enforcement, however, did not search that area, and it's unclear if cadaver dogs were ever taken there. Harold Johnson would tell detectives his brother Ted had not used the silo since the 80s, and that no one had been in there for a long time. Investigators have never stated who exactly found the body or what prompted them to look. However, Ted Johnson would later tell a reporter that his son found the body. Law enforcement has been very quiet about the evidence found, but they have confirmed that he was still wearing a $600 watch, and that he had a pair of pants neatly folded on top of him. Because of a backlog in forensic labs, his death wouldn't be ruled a murder until 7 months later in August. The case pretty much went cold after this, and it wasn't until 2022, when an Alabama Cold Case Facebook group began posting about the case, that a renewed interest would begin, which brought up new leads to the investigators. However, there are no official theories. Heck, law enforcement hasn't even stated how he was murdered, but the two rumors floating around the most seem to be drug trade or love triangle. Bonnie Bess McFadden, Arkansas. Retired teacher Bonnie McFadden was a 78-year-old widow that lived alone in Coal Hill, Arkansas. She actually lived down the road from her brother, whom she had daily contact with, but in August of 2005, several days would go by without hearing from Bonnie. Her brother, Tom Davenport, would drive over to check on her. When he got to her house, the first thing he noticed was the gate to her property was unlocked, which is very unusual. He would get out and walk into the house to check on her, but there were no signs of Bonnie. Her brother was worried, and only got more so when he walked out into the driveway and discovered that her car was also unlocked. Just another strange clue that something wasn't right, because she always kept them locked. The police were called in to do a search, but found nothing, other than they did discover some of her financial papers and purse was missing from the residence. Her family would later state that Bonnie had managed several rental properties and developed a close friendship with one of her tenants, a man in his 20s. She had purchased him many gifts, including a motorcycle, a backhoe, as well as taking him on a trip to Hawaii. Her family was concerned about this and tried to discourage her from seeing him, but she did not listen. Her family has also said they believe they know who is responsible, and I can only assume that it's this young guy. Investigators would eventually establish she was last seen making a bank transaction for several $1,000s at a bank in Clarksville, about 15 miles away. This was the last official sighting of her. Police would eventually get a tip in 2009 that she had been dumped into a lake in the area, but divers searched and found nothing. Sadly, this is one that just doesn't have a lot of info. I think it's probably safe to say she is deceased. But what happened to her? How did she vanish without a trace? Is the unnamed young man responsible? Melissa Witt, Arkansas. We stay in Arkansas for this next one. Fort Smith, Arkansas to be exact. Melissa Witt was a 19-year-old college student at West Ark Community College and was living with her mother Mary Ann in 1994. She also worked part-time at a local dental clinic as a dental assistant and kept a pretty busy schedule with school and work, and planned on becoming a dental hygienist. That December 1st was like a typical day for Melissa, but as she got ready to go to campus for class, she would ask her mom if she could borrow some money. Her mom said no, which led to a small disagreement, but no major spat. So Melissa headed off to class. Her mom would go to a bowling alley later that afternoon, and she would leave a note from Melissa stating that she loved her and that she could find her at the bowling alley, and that if she wanted to come by, her mom would buy them a burger. So after class and work, Missy would see the note and head towards the bowling alley her mom was at. It was about 6:30 to 7 p.m. as she pulled into the parking lot and, strangely, never made it inside. Once Marianne realized Melissa was missing, she would call the police, and what can only be described as bizarre is the fact that no one found her car for 2 days. And when they did, it was still in the bowling alley parking lot. I've not been able to find out how this slip-up even happened, but the detectives would go over the scene and made a pretty quick determination that Melissa had been abducted. They based this on evidence that suggested a struggle had taken place around the car, including blood that was found in the parking lot and on Missy's keys, which had been turned into the bowling alley. Her earring was also recovered, but even with this info, there was very little investigators had to go by. This was the early 90s, and cameras were not everywhere. The case is very similar to that of Jody Huisentruit, except for one key fact. 6 weeks later, 2 hunters in the Ozark National Forest, about 45 miles from her home, Missy's body was found nude and had been placed near a headstone-shaped rock. She had been strangled. Her clothes and belongings, however, were missing and never found. An early lead into this case was a convict named Larry Swearingen, who would eventually be executed for the murder of Melissa Trotter, another 19-year-old, who was just killed 4 years later in 1998 in a very similar manner, and was also found in the large forest of Arkansas. He was even known to be in the area when Melissa was abducted. Of course, Swearingen denied this, and if he was guilty, he took any details with him to the grave. Another suspect bandied about is a man named Travis Crouch, who was released from jail just 2 months prior in another state. Once he was released, it is known he did go to Arkansas. He was never able to provide an alibi for investigators either. He has a long criminal past, including sexual assault and violence, and is currently in prison again for sexual assault of a young woman he abducted in a mall parking lot, who only escaped because he passed out from drugs. He lived near the location where the body was found, and is still considered a suspect. Other theories propose that she was abducted by someone that she knew. Melissa's mother, Marianne, would pass away in 2011 at the age of 75, with no resolution in her daughter's case. Land's End Light, South Carolina. In my research into the paranormal events in the South, I found pretty quickly that almost every state had a ghost light story. Some are better than others. This is one of the better ones. In South Carolina, one of the most popular paranormal stories is that of the Land's End Light, located in Beaufort. The yellowish orb appears on a 3-mile stretch of Land's End Road on St. Helena Island. This particular stretch of road is known as one of the most haunted roads in the entire state, and it's been called South Carolina's own Sleepy Hollow. According to witnesses that have seen it, the orb usually appears at a good distance away, at a height of about 10 to 12 feet above the road, before abruptly zooming up into the air and out of view. There are other reports that say the light hovers next to cars or chases them as well. Of course, that's less believed. When it first appears, it usually looks like the single beam of an automobile light, kinda like when you pass a vehicle that has one headlight blown out. As it gets closer, it gets bigger, but dimmer than a headlight. It has an oval shape and the color of yellow and pale orange. The light is also somewhat reliable, as many report that you can see it every night if you're patient enough to wait. And crazy enough, it is officially responsible for at least one car crash. So what is this thing? Well, paranormal believers tell of a story of Confederate soldiers who were stationed in the area to protect its strategic position on the Beaufort River. Apparently, in 1861, some soldiers got into a fight with some of the local residents, and a soldier, Private Frank Quigley, was decapitated. Legend says that he now wanders the Land's End Road with an old iron lantern in his hand, looking for his missing head, the orb being the lantern. But there's also the skeptical point of view, which says it's nothing more than swamp gas, which I get so tired of reading about. But this claim of swamp gas is even weaker when you realize there are no swamps in the area. Jerrold Potter, Missouri. On June 28, 1968, Pontiac City, Illinois councilman Jerrold Potter and his wife Carrie would board a chartered flight from Kankakee, Illinois to a Dallas Lions Club conference. The plane was a twin-propeller DC-3 type. About an hour after takeoff, the plane would cross into Missouri and was about 8,000 feet over the Ozarks, approaching Rolla and the former Clark National Forest. Potter would tell his wife that he was going to the restroom and would return shortly. He made his way past the other 21 passengers, stopping briefly to speak to a friend. After Jerrold excused himself to the restroom, the plane would shake briefly and then continued on without trouble. Some would say later on that it wasn't even a shake, but more like they heard a sound of wind, while others claimed they heard a loud sound like a bang, but no one really thought much of it. The flight went on for a few more minutes, and Jerrold did not return. Carrie would alert a flight attendant, who then walked to the restroom to make sure Jerrold was okay. To her shock, she seen that the rear door had been opened. Meanwhile, pilot Miguel Cabeza was just starting to notice a red light flashing on his control panel. That light was the door open light, so he sent co-pilot Roy Backus back to investigate. But before Backus could even make it to the back, he ran into the flight attendant, who told him the rear door was open and Mr. Potter was missing. The co-pilot himself would hurry to the back and look. He discovered that the onboarding door had been opened and the retractable stairs used by passengers had been extended, explaining the drag and the warning light. It appeared to him that the latch designed to prevent the door from opening had broke mid-flight. He would then rush back to the front and told the pilot Cabeza, who would make an emergency landing in Springfield. Strangely for the 60s, news had traveled so fast that the media was already at the airport waiting. Finally, once landing, they would do a head count and everyone was still on the plane, except for Potter. This mystery is sort of twofold. For one, what exactly happened? Secondly, just why hasn't his body been recovered? As far as what happened, there's various theories. One suggestion that was offered by the pilots is that the plane's brief rattle caused Jerrold to stumble and slam into the exit door, causing it to fly open. In fact, research found that a similar event happened in February 1950 when the same door on another DC-3 suddenly opened and a flight attendant plunged to her death. And in what has to be a 1 in a million odds, another incident happened that same exact day, but in that occurrence, the flight attendant was able to hold onto the door until the aircraft safely landed. Others have suggested that Potter mistook the exit door for the restroom door, which is a bit hard to believe, considering it would have taken a lot of effort to open the door. However, the restroom was in an alcove area near the cargo storage. That door sat on the left, and directly across from it on the right was the door for the boarding, so it is possible. Finally, the last theory is suicide or an insurance cash out for his wife, yet there was no evidence that supported either of these claims. As far as the location, authorities searched a wide swath of land encompassing Marys, Phelps, and Pulaski County. The search was made up of Missouri State Troopers, soldiers from nearby Fort Leonard Wood, as well as the local sheriff's department and volunteers. The search was called off about a week later by Carrie herself due to several days of bad weather. She was afraid someone else might lose their life looking for Jerrold when it was obvious that he had passed. NTSB and the FAA would do an investigation, and they eventually confirmed that the chain had failed, obviously. But still, why was he at that door? His wife would pass away in 1991 at the age of 81 without Jerrold's remains ever being found or knowing the exact circumstances leading up to his death. Honey Island Swamp Monster / Swamp Ape, Louisiana and Mississippi. Okay, this one is kinda cheating, but I went ahead and rolled 2 up into 1 on this one. Honey Island Swamp is in Louisiana on the Louisiana-Mississippi border, and it's here that an alleged cryptid is said to live. This cryptid is known in Louisiana as the Honey Island Swamp Monster, or sometimes the Louisiana Wookiee. In Mississippi, it's been called various things, such as Swamp Ape, but I'm pretty sure it's all supposed to be one creature. Its tracks are that of 3-toed webbed feet. Cryptid researchers claim that it's possible a Bigfoot evolved to have webbed feet to better suit its swampy environment. It was first reported in 1963 when Harlan Ford and Billy Mills went deep into the swamp searching for an abandoned cabin that Harlan had previously spotted by plane. The friends would come up on a clearing where they spotted the creature, who kept eye contact with them, but only for a moment before it escaped into the underbrush. Ford would later say the following, quote, It was nothing like I'd ever seen before, ugly and sinister, and looking like something out of a horror movie," end quote. 11 years later, Ford and Mills would return to the area for a duck hunting trip. They would find several dead boars with their throats torn out along the way. They eventually realized the boars were way too far away from the water to have been killed by alligators. They began to speculate that it was probably done by the creature they had seen over a decade ago. This would be confirmed later on when they finally stumbled upon the three-toed webbed feet tracks around the boars. And not wanting to face this creature again, the men retreated back to their vehicle at a fast pace. They did, however, return later that night to make a cast of the footprints. There have been other accounts since this as well. One came from a man named Ted Williams, who claimed to have seen the creature several times, and he speculated there were many of them running around. And allegedly, Ted went out to the swamp in his canoe one day to set some trot lines and never returned. I could not verify this anywhere, but I was able to find out that Ted actually existed because there is audio of him talking about seeing this creature. But if he really died in the swamp, it could have happened many different ways, not just because of the Honey Island swamp monster. The creature is described as being 7.5 feet tall and weighing between 400 to 500 plus pounds. Its thick coat is matted gray or brown hair and swamp weed. Its eyes are yellow and seemingly reptilian, and the smell it emits is reportedly like the stench of death. The main theory on this one is misidentification of a bear, but cryptid believers insist that it's related to the Sasquatch. Werewolf of Henrico County, Virginia. I typically don't cover werewolf mysteries that much, just because it doesn't seem as credible to me as other cryptid sightings. It also feels more paranormal than cryptid, but I really like this one, so I decided to cover it. Although I can't find an exact date, it seems that the sighting started around 2018 in Henrico County, a suburb of Richmond, Virginia, specifically an area called Confederate Hills Recreation Center, where there is a very open space with some patches of trees here and there. Many of the early ones were debunked as pranks, but the group of sightings that came later on have not been debunked yet. In fact, it's said that many of the people living in the neighborhood have seen this creature on more than one occasion. The descriptions are as follows. It's about 6 feet tall, covered with black hair with some silver peppered in, sometimes described as grayish white. It has the body of a man, but face of an animal, particularly like that of a wolf. It has been spotted upright many times, but when it runs off, it runs on all fours. Some stories claim it's only spotted on nights with a full moon. One woman claimed that it came so close to where she was sitting that it almost showed its face, but as soon as she spotted it, the creature fled to the woods. Other reports state that it's more skittish than one would typically think of a werewolf. Some accounts claim that it has chased people, although in a playful manner. Only a few people have mentioned it growling or barking. So what are people seeing if these anonymous reports are to be taken as truth? Well, the most obvious explanation is it's a prank by some local citizen living there. If it's not a hoax, cryptid enthusiasts have speculated that it could be a Sasquatch or even a dogman. You know, if it's not a real werewolf. Raymond Lamar Green Jr., Georgia. On November 1st, 1978, a woman named Donna Green was in Grady Memorial Hospital in Atlanta, where she had just given birth to her baby Raymond. Once she recovered, she made her way to the nursery window to look at the newborn. While watching from the window, another woman would come up and introduce herself as Lisa Morris. She would tell Donna that she was visiting her sister, who had also just given birth. Donna would eventually go back to her hospital room, and Lisa followed her and sat around and chat. And what would end up being a foreboding sign, Lisa would ask Donna many questions about her and baby Raymond before she would finally leave. Donna would remain in the hospital for 2 more days, until November 3rd, and in that time, Lisa had came back to visit her twice. On the day Donna and Raymond were discharged and were ready to leave, Lisa would ask for a ride home. Donna said yes, and the two left. The driver would drop Donna off first at her apartment, then take Lisa to Stanton Road, where she requested to be dropped off at. Strangely, the driver would state later on that he never seen Lisa enter any of the buildings. And now on top of this, Lisa knew where Donna lived, and 3 days later, Lisa would show up unannounced at Donna's apartment. She told Donna she wanted to see how her and Raymond were, and I can only imagine that the woman was very convincing at being sweet and caring, because I think most parents would be alarmed, but maybe Donna was just naive. She was only 16 at the time. Anyways, Donna let her in And about an hour after catching up, Donna would decide to go take a shower and left Raymond with her brother Tony, Raymond's uncle, to tend to him while Lisa remained visiting. It should be noted here too that Tony was also taking care of his other sister's baby, so he was pretty tired to say the least. About 15 minutes later, Donna would get out of the shower and immediately realized that both Raymond and Lisa were gone. Tony told his sister he had started nodding off while watching Raymond, and at some point, the newborn started crying, and Lisa picked him up and took him outside in an attempt to get him to stop. Tony thought that Lisa was Donna's friend and that she was okay with it, so he thought nothing of it. Donna would run outside to look for them and did not see them, but luckily a neighbor would tell Donna that she seen Lisa carrying Raymond in a blanket and got into the passenger side of a brown vehicle where a man waited. They would then drive away, and ever since that day, Raymond has never been seen again, nor has the woman. Lisa was described as being 23 to 24 years old at the time, 5'5" to 5'6", and 160 to 170 pounds. She had light brown skin, a small nose, full lips, dark eyes, and a scar on the right side of her face, scars on her temple, and mole on her left cheek. And probably not too surprisingly, that name was fake. Investigators did determine that basically all the information she provided to Donna was made up. None of the newborn mothers at the hospital had a sister named Lisa Morris, and heck, no one in Atlanta even had that name. They couldn't even find anyone that matched the description of the abductor, although Lisa had pointed to a baby in the nursery who had the last name Morris attached and claimed that that was her niece. It wasn't, but that's where she got the name. To make things worse, Atlanta PD would lose Raymond's case file sometime after this and never found it. They had to relaunch an entire new investigation. They would eventually come to a somewhat unexpected conclusion, and that was that the abductors did not kidnap the baby for themselves. Instead, they believe Raymond was sold for adoption outside the United States. How they come to this conclusion, they never said. However, it is far from certain, and no one really knows what happened to baby Raymond. Grunch Road Monster, Louisiana. The Grunch Road Monster, aka the New Orleans Grunch, is an alleged chupacabra-type creature spotted in New Orleans. It's described as a cross between dog and reptilian. Their sightings go back as far as New Orleans' founding. It's commonly described as being goat-like, but having leathery or scaly black-gray skin and having sharp long horns or quills running down its back. It's about 3 to 4 feet high. They're also said to be more intelligent and have human-like skills, like opening doors and using tools, sort of like a monkey does. Other reports state that the cryptid howls like a wolf, and when it's alarmed, it screeches like an ape or a banshee, as well as leaving a strong stench. Reportedly, you can see the creature's eyes glow an unusual red, orange, or blue-green, while other reports say that it has bat wings and a tail or long fur and goat-like markings in a gray or black silky coat. There are reports of seeing this creature feasting on dogs or chasing cats, as well as sanitation workers who claim to see them raiding garbage cans or chasing garbage trucks along the New Orleans East Haines Boulevard. As far as the name, well, that comes from a road labeled Grunch Road sometime in the early days of New Orleans. The exact location is disputed, but most agree that it was somewhere in eastern New Orleans. It was this area around that road that farm animals would begin to disappear, and then people started reporting seeing the creature. The earliest reports of sightings go back to around the early 1800s and all the way up to the 1980s when sightings dropped off. But after Hurricane Katrina in 2005, the sightings would pop up again. Most claim that this was due to the hurricane flushing them out of their habitat. So what are people seeing? The conventional take is that most of these sightings can be attributed to mangy raccoons or just straight up an urban legend. Cryptozoologists, however, disagree. Shondra May, Mississippi. On February 4th, 1986, in Scotttown, Mississippi, Shondra May would go into her shift at McDonald's in the small town of Forest. The 17-year-old was a senior at Leake Academy and would graduate soon. That night, business was slow. The manager would come out and tell Shondra she could leave early. So Shondra would call her mother Janelle to tell her she was getting off early. But on her way, she would stop at a store, now known as Burke's Outlet, to buy a Valentine's Day card for her boyfriend. She then headed north towards her home. But when Shondra did not arrive, her mother would become understandably worried. Janelle would call her next-door neighbors / in-laws and would ask her brother-in-law to ride out and make sure Shondra had not broken down somewhere. But they didn't have to go far, because when Janelle stepped outside, she seen Shondra's car less than 100 yards away from her home. Some accounts say it was between their driveway and their in-laws' driveway. They would go to the car and discovered that all of Shondra's belongings were still there, including her purse. Only her driver's license was missing. The car's engine was off too, but the driver's door was open, as well as the driver's window, which was slightly open. The radio was on, although the volume was all the way down. Yet, there was no sign of Shondra. Authorities were called and a search ensued, which involved local, state, and the FBI, but nothing was found. There wasn't much in the way of evidence either. Making matters worse was that it wasn't even treated as a crime scene. The car was never even dusted for prints. Not that it probably would have mattered, because the family had contaminated the scene before detectives even arrived. It was like Shondra had vanished into thin air. Posters were put out, and tons of people were on the lookout for her. 22 days later, on what would have been her 18th birthday, an off-duty firefighter would come across her nude body when he was out near a creek. Shondra had been bound with industrial tape and wrapped in black bags. Investigators fished her out and took her back for an autopsy. The medical examiner found that she had been bound and gagged with packing tape and a processing facility in the area, but the first autopsy yielded no conclusive results, so a second one was ordered to be done. That examination found she had died of strangulation and had been sexually assaulted. He estimated that she lived 17 to 19 days after being abducted, and that her body had been in the water for 3 to 5 days. There was also some speculation that she could have been exposed to refrigeration, which would obviously change the estimate on how many days that she stayed alive. But now came the who. There's been a ton of suspects over the years, including Shondra's father and her boyfriend. Both were cleared pretty quickly though. There was a theory that an individual known to pose as a policeman around Meridian, Mississippi, about 45 miles away, could be responsible, but there was no evidence. Local law enforcement all took polygraphs in an attempt to expose anyone hiding within the system, but they all passed. Investigators still feel that the suspect was someone pretending to be an officer, or even a real officer, and they base this on the fact that Shondra's license was the only thing missing, and the fact that there was no sign of a struggle. It looked like Shondra voluntarily went. However, her license could have been missing just because she had it in her pocket. The second theory is that it was just someone that knew Shondra, which is why there was no sign of a struggle. The current sheriff has stated that he believes he knows who is responsible. They are just lacking that one piece of evidence that will be the crucial link. Likewise, a cold case unit of retired police officers came together in 2021 to try and solve the case. They have stated that there were 20 suspects brought to them originally, and that they have narrowed it down to 3 or 4 people they believe the perpetrator to be. Asbury, Respus, North Carolina. Around 9 a.m. on September 30th, 1931, a man walking just outside of Greensboro, North Carolina, would notice smoke coming from a local farm that belonged to a family named the Leonards. He would rush over to check it out, and it's then that he saw the family's home burning. This neighbor would attempt to save some of the family's possessions because they were not home, but when he walked in, he noticed pools of blood. Shortly after, the homeowner, Thomas Leonard, would show up and the two would extinguish the flames before it got out of control. Once that was over, they searched the home and sadly, Leonard's 9-year-old daughter, Vera, was found wrapped in a quilt under a bed. Her skull had been crushed and she had been charred by the flames. About 100 yards away from the home, a bloody coat was found and signs of a struggle. Investigators theorized she had been killed about 8:15 while waiting on the school bus. This was rural North Carolina in the 1930s, so of course, curious onlookers came by to see what was going on. But strangely, one older black man seemed to leave and come back several times. Eventually, police got suspicious and took him in for questioning. Meanwhile, they would go search his home and found blood-stained overalls and shoes that matched the bloody footprints at the crime scene. The man, who called himself Will Moore, was a hired hand for the farm next door to the Leonard farm, and he obviously denied being involved until he was shown the bloody overalls. He would then confess to attacking Vera with a stick and setting the home on fire to cover it up. Police would also discover this man was not Will Moore. In fact, it was a convict that had escaped prison over a decade ago named Asbury Respus. He claimed that he attacked her because he was on cocaine and alcohol, which sent him into a violent rage. The trial started soon, and the defense claimed he was mentally unfit to stand trial. Psychiatrists, as well as people that knew him, all contradicted this and said he was not insane. The trial and conviction were quick, and he was sentenced to death. It's after his sentencing that we would learn a little bit more about Respus, although we hardly know anything prior to 1900. We do know that he claimed in his childhood he had fallen off a barn and hit his head, which he claimed changed him and caused his violent behavior. As an adult, the indentation from the impact was still visible on his skull. In 1910, he killed for the first time a black woman named Becky Store in Virginia, and like the Leonard girl, he used a stick. Then in 1912, he would kill another black woman named Lizzie Banks, this time with a gun, and then a third black woman named Zenie Britt, who he beat to death. He then followed this up by killing a 53-year-old man named Ed B. Wynn, following a domestic dispute, again by gunshot. This time, Respus was caught and was charged with first-degree murder and sentenced only to 15 years for some reason. However, he did not finish his sentence because he and several other inmates escaped in 1916, and in those days, it was much easier to live off the grid, and that's exactly what he did, doing odd jobs in Virginia and North Carolina. But in January 1918, he would kill again in North Carolina, this time a white woman in her 60s named Jeannie Gilbreth, and with an axe, and then burned the house down, and the police blamed her death on the fire. In the summer of 1920, he would drown a 4-year-old white boy named Robert Osborne by holding his head underwater with his feet, and then told police he found him that way, and the police actually believed him. Finally, in 1925, he killed an elderly white woman in her 80s named Eunice Stevenson. He broke in and beat her to death and tried to cover it up by hanging her from the rafters, making people think that it was a suicide. Investigators didn't fall for it this time though, but they actually arrested a different man, and Respus got away. It wasn't until he killed the first victim we discussed, 9-year-old Vera Leonard, that he was finally captured. Now here's the mystery. All of these murders I just told you about, except for the 2 that landed him in prison, we only know about these because of one man, prison warden H.H. Honeycutt. Honeycutt would state that Respus had confessed all of these murders to him the day before his execution, and if Respus was telling the truth, that would mean he was North Carolina's first serial killer. But because we're only left with his word, which we got from Honeycutt, we're left to wonder, was he really responsible? It's not uncommon for serial killers to lie about their victim count. Likewise, it's been known that at least a few times, investigators have fed information about other unsolved murders to serial killers, to which the suspect will then use this to confess. But there were no detectives here, only Honeycutt, although at least one source stated that a few reporters were there. But Honeycutt probably wouldn't have known about these unsolved murders. So Respus was telling the truth, right? Most likely. But it's also possible he read or heard about the deaths and just claimed to be responsible. Because the fact is, one victim's death was ruled accidental due to fire, the young boy's was ruled accidental due to drowning, while someone else was arrested for one of the murders he claimed. Either Respus was lying, or the police were laughably bad. His real victim count will probably never be known. Charleston County Jane Doe, South Carolina. The Charleston County Jane Doe is an alleged victim of serial killer Samuel Little. She is the only South Carolina victim whose remains have not been found. The only thing we know about her is from Samuel Little's confession, and again, investigators consider him to be very credible, as he has never falsely confessed to any murders. It came in November 2018 when he would tell detectives that her murder occurred in 1972 or 73, or between 1977 and 1982. He was driving his black Thunderbird when he seen her near a military base, and possibly picked her up where a couple bars existed at the time. He then took her down Highway 1, or I-26, to a field with a concrete circle around it, possibly a helicopter landing pad for a closed-down hospital. He would then strangle her to death, dragged her out by her legs into the tall grass close to the pad, and left her face down with her dress pulled up. He also stated she was about 28 years old. She has still not been found. Chapel Hill Ghost Light. Another ghost light, this time in Tennessee. I know I have a few of these on here, but ghost lights really intrigue me. I feel like a few of them are truly unexplained, and this is one of those. The tiny town of Chapel Hill, Tennessee, which is about 25 miles south of Murfreesboro, plays home to one of Tennessee's most paranormal legends, and it takes place at a set of railroad tracks. The legend has many different tales, and it's hard to say which, if any of these are connected to the actual light. But the main story is that a man named Skip Agent was struck by a train in 1942 as he was walking the tracks, and since that point, people have spotted the ghost light, which is usually seen way down the track for periods of time. Yet it is not a train. But you may be thinking, it's not unusual for the railroad track to have lights on them at certain spots. But the thing is, those lights are stationary. The ghost light has been seen swaying back and forth across the track. Sometimes it moves forward, sometimes it goes back. Local townsfolk as well as out-of-towners would sometimes even throw watch parties and spend all night out watching the tracks, just waiting for the light. And sometimes at these parties, they would even take guns out to shoot at the light to see if it went away, which of course caused problems. One person who was searching for the light even got hit by a train and killed. After this, local law enforcement started cracking down on any ghost hunter around the track. The sightings of the ghost light have decreased in recent years. Most attribute this to the town expanding. Oh, and it goes without saying, but the skeptical theory is that it's swamp gas. Tennessee Wildman. This cryptid's first sighting goes way back to the 1800s in McNairy County, Tennessee. In fact, a Hagerstown newspaper from March 5, 1871 warned local residents about the wild man lurking in Piney in West Tennessee. The article would go on to say that it made wild, horrid screams and attempted to carry women off. This wasn't the only article either, by the way. There were a bunch of them after the Civil War, especially in Tennessee and North Carolina. There was even one account of 4 hunters in East Tennessee who encountered and then cornered the beast. They attempted to seize him to haul him back to Cleveland, Tennessee, only for him to overpower the men and then run. But the most recent significant sighting took place in 1995 in Elizabethton, when a man named Rob Phillips, along with his cousin, were hiking to the Bee Cliffs. It would start to rain as they noticed something odd in the forest. That was that everything becomes silent, and in this silence, they would all of a sudden hear the snapping of a twig, followed by an eerie inhuman scream. Of course, they fled the dark forest, and both of them would find separate trees to hide behind. As they were cowering in place, they spotted the creature about 15 feet away. Rob's cousin would then take off towards a hill, and Rob would soon follow. Rob would later describe the creature as 9 foot tall, with red beady eyes and a set of claws, and a horrible smell that was kind of like that of a dead animal. One thing that kind of gives doubt to this claim, though, is that he waited 20 years to tell anyone, and he only revealed it then, after being on the Monsters and Mysteries in America TV show. A bit suspicious, to say the least. However, his description of the creature was pretty close to the other ones that had been told, although most sightings say the creature was about 7 feet tall. It's also said that it is very aggressive, and it's thought that it might be a rival of Sasquatch, whom it fights for territory, which is ironic, because it sort of looks like a Sasquatch, only it looks more human. They are known to have great speed, agility, and strength as well, and they are also known to target dogs and women, as well as some reports state to have seen them moving silently towards homes and fleeing once they are spotted. There have been hunting parties that have went out to try to locate this creature, but they have came up empty-handed. It's thought that there are probably a few of these running around, especially since some of the same sightings have taken place across the border in Kentucky and North Carolina, although sightings have decreased since the 70s. I-4 Dead Zone, Florida. This overpass on I-4, located just north of Orlando at the St. Johns River, is known commonly around the area as the Dead Zone because of 4 graves that lie beneath the highway. Apparently, this goes all the way back to 1887, when a yellow fever epidemic broke out and killed 4 people from a German family in this small colony. The priest was also dead, and there was no one there to administer last rites, so these 4 were buried without ceremony. The colony itself fell soon after this. In 1904, the land was bought by a man named Albert Hawkins, who then cleared it for farming. He ended up finding the graves, and out of respect, he farmed around the cemetery, which then ended up sitting in the middle of the field like an island. Hawkins died in 1939, but in his time of owning the land, he would lease it out to other farmers. One of these men tried removing the wires from around the graves. Later that day, his house burned down. Hawkins' own home would burn down after he started removing the rotten wooden markers from the graves. Once he passed, his widow owned the land to 1960, when it was then purchased by the state for the building of Interstate 4. The state surveyors did find the cemetery, but they did not remove the graves. Instead, they just covered it up with fill dirt. And weirdly enough, right after this happened, Hurricane Donna on September 16, 1960, would hit and go right across the graves. The resulting flooding disrupted the construction and put it off for several months. Hurricane Donna ended up being the worst storm to hit Central Florida in a century. It ended up causing millions of dollars in damage to many areas of Central Florida and was responsible for the loss of many lives. But most eerie of all was its path. It actually crossed South Florida from the Atlantic and appeared to be heading westward into the Gulf of Mexico when it took a strange turn and basically followed I-4 through Central Florida, passing over the graves by midnight. The storm then exited into the Atlantic. Many from the paranormal community believe that it happened because the highway construction crew had no respect for the dead. Nowadays, weird stuff continues to happen in the area, such as reports that cell phones pick up strange voices at the south of I-4 bridge in Seminole County. One woman even claimed, as she was talking, her conversation was interrupted by, quote, the voices of the dead, end quote. There's also the extremely high number of accidents. Some sources state over 2,000 since 1963. Reports of ghost hitchhikers, as well as ghostly voices on radios and cell phones, or sometimes even children laughing. Other times, snarling and growling are heard. There's also reports of a white mist and balls of light that have been spotted. Even on the opening day of the interstate, just over the dead zone, saw a truck carrying frozen shrimp jackknife, which led to one casualty, and the wreck, well, it happened right above the graves. But skeptics claim that there's nothing paranormal going on, and that the wrecks are caused by the fact that I-4 gets a ton of traffic, more than it's probably built to handle, and that it's possible the loss of phone call signal is due to the limestone deposits in the area, which I've never heard that one before, and that everything else can be chalked up to hysteria. But I ask you, what do you believe? The Night Marauder, Tennessee. In 2021, Maryville College history professor Dr. Nancy Lackland Sofer was preparing an undergraduate course for her 2021 spring semester entitled History of Murder. She designed it to appeal to history majors, but also for students involved in criminal justice, and she came up with the idea of using local cases to base her course on. And in doing this, she would scan the newspaper archives and come across a headline that surprised her. It was dated July 1926 and read, Night Marauder kills woman, age 60. Maryville, Alcoa folk tremble while the murderer goes unapprehended. She was unable to view the whole story, however, as the article hadn't been digitally preserved yet, but this would spark Nancy's interest, and she would look more into the case. She found that the police had originally believed the attacker to be a former son-in-law, but the woman's daughter told investigators that it was not. Unfortunately, the paper told no more. So Nancy would have to go to the local library to use a microfilm reader to look over more papers from the time period. What she found shocked her. Between 1919 and 1926, a serial killer known as the Night Marauder killed 8 people in Knoxville, Maryville, and Alcoa, and was never captured. And yet somehow, this had all been forgotten. The first attack happened in August 1919, when a 27-year-old woman named Birdie Lindsay was sharing a bed with her cousin, when a man armed with a pistol came in and threatened to kill them if they did not do what he said. He would climb into bed with the 2 women, and Birdie became frightened and tried to run. He would shoot her and then flee the scene. That would be the first of 45 home invasions the Night Marauder would commit, with multiple instances happening on single nights. By the end, he had sexually assaulted 8 women, shot 4 that resisted, and killed 8 people in total. The first suspect was a biracial man named Maurice Mays, who was long rumored to be the illegitimate son of the white mayor, John McMillan. It's now known, just like then, Mays was falsely accused, mainly for the fact that the assaults continued to happen while he was in prison. Sadly, he would be executed for the crimes, and I would be amiss here if I did not mention that news of Mays' arrest actually led to the 1919 Knoxville riots, and the National Guard had to be called in. Then in 1925 and 26, a white Maryville resident named William D. Sheffey was arrested on 5 counts, one for the murder of Luther Wells and the sexual assault of his wife Ada, and one murder charge for Clyde Poe and the sexual assault of his wife Flora Poe. and one for breaking into a third home. The trial attracted media attention even as far away as California. Local Tennesseans packed the courthouse. The trial would actually be set on the Luther Wells murder charge. The first and second trial ended in mistrial, and the third ended in acquittal. After all this, charges were dismissed. Sheffy would then move to California and start a new life. And just like that, the killing stopped. So did the investigation and media attention. Interestingly, Sheffy also had been tried and acquitted in 1915 over the death of a young woman in Sevierville. The killer's moniker came from the fact that he typically struck at night, and usually at residents that did not have electricity yet, which is over half the population at this point. He got to know the house well enough that, according to a couple of survivors, he would get into the room and remove all the matches from next to the lanterns so they couldn't get any light. And if he broke in on a couple, he would shoot the man, and while the husband bled out, he would sexually assault the wife. And if she screamed, fought back, or tried to get away, he shot her too. He also sent a letter to Blount County Sheriff John McCampbell that read, quote, "You are never going to catch me," end quote. As mentioned, this mystery was just recently rediscovered and is still being researched by Dr. Nancy Lankland Sofer and her students, and they now run a blog at thenightmarauderproject.com, which covers a lot more info on the case. I will link it in the description below. UTMB Galveston Face, Texas. At the University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston, Texas, the Ewing building plays home to a small but curious mystery. It seems that a ghostly face has popped up on an outside wall and appears that it is watching the parking lot down below. Funnily enough, the University of Texas actually looked into it and said it's nothing more than a watermark, just like many of the other buildings in the seaside town that have the same thing. When it first appeared, it was on the 4th concrete block up from the ground, and in order to keep paranormal investigators away, the school sandblasted it off the surface. But shortly after this, it appeared on the 3rd concrete block below where it had just been removed. So a second sandblasting started, and the face once again moved to a new location, down 1 block below, and the school after this attempt never tried again, and the face remains on the same spot to this day. Some claim that the university stopped because they were afraid that if they removed it again, it would move to the inside of the building. But what makes this one odd is, like I mentioned previously, is that the face pops up in different parts of the building. How is that happening? Well, if it is paranormal, several theories have been proposed about just who the face is, which seems to be that of a man. One theory is that it was the former farmer that owned some of the land the university is now on. Apparently, the university offered to buy his land from him, and he declined, and then prior to his death, made his family promise to never sell the land to them. However, that's exactly what they did, and it's thought this was his way to haunt the university. Another theory, which is based on something more concrete, pun intended, is that the face belonged to former Texas Ranger and legend William A. Wallace. Wallace owned land about 3 miles or so east along the bay across from UTMB, as well as owning much of Galveston Island for that matter, at least according to historical surveys that were done. He had actually been granted that land for fighting in the Texas Revolution. He then met with the President of Texas, Sam Houston, who signed the documents which did indeed grant the land. However, for reasons I cannot find, the state of Texas didn't follow through on their promises, and he and his lawyer ended up in a long and bitter dispute over the land, and he never actually received it. And now, if you look at the face and his picture, well, there's a bit of a resemblance. Yet, the problem with this is the land that UTMB is now on was not the land that Wallace was set to get. Of course, the skeptical theory is that our brain just sees patterns and randomness, but that doesn't explain why the face has moved to 2 different panels after being sandblasted away. The first flying saucer, Texas. We all know that mysterious objects in the sky have been recorded throughout history, but did you know the first flying saucer report came from Texas in 1878? According to the front page news of the Denison Daily News from January 25, 1878, farmer John Martin was hunting 6 miles north of town when he spotted something in the distance. The article read that John's attention was directed to a dark object high up in the southern sky, which was then followed by saying that its shape and velocity with which the object seemed to approach riveted his attention, and he strained his eyes to discover its character. The article would go on to say that Martin said the object was about the size of an orange, but it got bigger and brighter as it approached, and that he stared at it so long that it temporarily blinded him. By the time he could see again, it was almost directly overhead, and that it now was about the size of a large saucer, and was soaring across the sky at a high altitude and an incredible speed. Of course, no one knows what it was, and we're going on the account of one man, but is it possible he really did witness a flying saucer, the first of its kind? We will never know, as it wasn't really looked into. It did get picked up in a couple of more newspapers, but it was not discussed again until 1950, when it appeared in the book, The Flying Saucers Are Real. The only thing we know for sure is that according to the US Census, there was a farmer named John Martin living in the area at the time. The most compelling thing to me is that this sighting took place way before sightings become a thing, and Roswell was still a half a century into the future. Mamie Thurman, West Virginia. In 1932, 32-year-old wife Mamie and 48-year-old husband Jack would move from their home in Kentucky to Logan County, West Virginia, where Jack was hired as a patrolman with the police department. The couple would end up renting out a small 2-room apartment over a garage that belonged to the Robertsons, Harry and Louise. Harry was a powerful man of the community and worked at the National Bank of Logan and served as treasurer of the Logan Public Library, as well as being the president of the city commission. Harry had actually helped Jack get his job as police officer, which he patrolled regularly on night shift. And on June 22, 1932, something shocking happened. A man hunting for blackberries would come across her lifeless body dumped on 22 Mountain, which was called Trace Mountain back then. Not only had she been murdered, but she was mutilated. 2 shots to the head, a fractured neck, her face was disfigured and powder burned, while her throat was cut ear to ear. By 8:30 that night, detectives had made their way to the home of Harry Robertson, the landlord. It's here that they arrested Harry and his black handyman, Clarence Stevenson, after they found several bloodstained rags in the basement, as well as an attempt to remove several spots of blood on the floor, and also finding a hole in the wall believed to have been made from a bullet. In addition, blood was found on the window, fender, and seat of his Ford sedan, and the back seat had been removed, and a tarp placed over the back to the front seat and rear part of the car, while curtains made of canvas were hung from the doors. But why would Robertson kill her? Well, upon questioning, Robertson would admit to having an affair with Mamie. He further stated he arranged dates with her with the help of his handyman, Stevenson. But this wasn't all that Robertson would reveal. The case would go before a grand jury, and suspiciously, many of the prominent citizens of the county made up the grand jury. Robertson would turn over a list that he claimed Mamie had given him of 16 of the most influential men in town that she was having affairs with. She had supposedly given him this list just a year prior, which sounds kinda sketchy. And although this list was never made public, we know that one of them was deceased by this point. 13 of them lived in town, and all but one were married. And again, suspiciously, some of these men were rumored to be part of the grand jury. Robertson would then testify that he continued seeing Mamie even though she refused to stop seeing other men. And it's unclear if Robertson's allegations of her seeing 16 men are true or not, but we do know several of the other citizens knew she was having numerous affairs, so it's safe to say she was seeing several powerful men. Robertson would admit that he seen her the day that she was killed, saying that she left his house shortly after taking his children to a local swimming pool. He later spent the evening with his son watching a prize fight and made it home at 9 p.m., which his wife confirmed. The magistrate ruled that the evidence was circumstantial, but was very damaging to both defendants, so he ordered Robertson and his handyman held to answer for a possible indictment. After a 4-day discussion, the jury did not indict Robertson. Instead, they indicted handyman Clarence Stevenson, which was made even stranger by the fact that witnesses could account for his every minute until he went to bed at 11 p.m. that night. The case went to trial, and Stevenson was actually convicted and sentenced to life in prison. His attorney would file a motion for a new trial. However, the Supreme Court turned down his appeal in 1933. He would die in prison from stomach cancer in 1942. There are actually 2 mysteries on this one. It's pretty much assumed that Stevenson was wrongly convicted, although he probably did help in disposing the body. But who really murdered Mamie? Okay, that's a stupid question. We all know it was Robertson. But the other mystery is, where are Mamie's remains? She was supposed to be buried in Logan Memorial Park in West Virginia, but some records show that she was transported back to Bradfordsville, Kentucky, her birth state. Yet, neither place has a record for her, and her remains are still lost to this day. Marshall County, John Doe, Alabama. On April 15, 1997, a 17-year-old was fishing in Marshall County, Alabama, at a creek off of Eagle Rock Drive. While there, he would come across a horrifying discovery: a headless body with his legs bound together at the ankles with ropes and wire ties, as well as air fresheners that lay nearby. The site was very remote and led to the investigators' belief that whoever was responsible knew the area well, because the suspect would have had to travel down a dirt road off of a back road just to get there, as well as having to be aware that the creek tended to flood a lot during the rainy periods. The killer was almost certainly a local. It was determined that the man probably died a week prior to being found, and died by gunshot or stabbing, but had also sustained other severe injuries. Afterwards, his hands, head, and feet had been removed by saw, and while that is not extremely surprising, as it was obviously a way to hide the identity, what is a bit odd is that his heart and spleen had been surgically removed, and it's been theorized that those organs were removed to hide injuries and destroy evidence, but it can't be ruled out that the man was killed to harvest his organs. Investigators were also fairly sure that he was killed somewhere else and just dumped here, and from other evidence found, he was only at this spot for about 3 days. The victim was a white male between 19 to 34, about 5'9", 120 pounds. His eye color and hair color are unknown, but his body hair was strawberry blonde. The sheriff's department would work with Parabon Nanolabs to develop a better description. They found he had freckles, blue eyes, and dark blonde or light brown hair. He was wearing a blue-green and gray vertically striped short-sleeve pullover and Levi jeans, and it appeared he had been dressed by someone after his death. A nervous man was also seen near the area when his body was dumped. He was 6'1" and 210 pounds, with black hair and a mustache, and was driving a 90s maroon Chevy truck with tinted windows and a Georgia tag. Both men remain unidentified. William and Peggy Stevenson, Kentucky. On May 29, 2011, in Florence, Kentucky, Beth Stevenson went to church like she did pretty much every Sunday, and when she got there, she would notice that her parents had not made it in yet, which was very uncharacteristic for them, since Peggy and Bill Stevenson were both very devout members of their church. Yet, the two 74-year-olds had not shown up, nor were they answering their daughter's calls. Beth would get a hold of her husband CJ and ask him to go check on the elderly couple. CJ would later call Beth and told her to get to her parents' home immediately. By the time she arrived, the whole area was already marked off with crime scene tape. Bill and Peggy were both dead, from a combination of blunt and sharp force trauma. No one has ever been charged in any relation to this murder. But what is interesting is that the detectives have traveled to at least 14 different states, tracking down numerous leads, interviewing over 250 people while collecting DNA from several others. So what prompted such a wide area search? Turns out that Bill had built a makeshift trailer church that he presided over on Sundays. The Truckers' Chapel, as it came to be known, was put along the highway, so truckers who still wished to practice their faith would still have a place to do so along their route. It seems like investigators thought one of these truckers could be responsible. By 2012, detectives would state an unknown DNA profile was found in multiple locations at the crime scene, apparently even at spots that could have only been left by the murderer. They would state that now they had the genetic profile of this person. The investigators have also stated that the bodies were staged and a message was left for law enforcement. They also know that the killer or killers stayed hours after the murder, and perhaps even left at one point, came back and inflicted one post-mortem wound to one of the victims. They also stated that photos had been arranged in the home, like some were face down, while others remained upright. Speaking of, every room in the home had been staged a certain way. In fact, Detective Cox would go onto a podcast and state that they are keeping the details private for now, but that if they did release them, no one would believe it. That's how bizarre this scene was. To add to an already crazy case, in March 2023, news broke that there could be a connection between the Stevenson's murder and the Delphi case. Now this has been confusing to say the least, but basically, a tip came in November 2022, after Richard Allen was arrested for the Delphi murders, that linked the case to the Stevensons, but yet was stated it had nothing to do with Allen, but with the case itself, which people took to mean that there was a second suspect in the Delphi case who had a connection with the Stevenson case, which makes sense because the prosecutor in the Delphi case has already stated that they have reason to believe there was a second suspect. Yet, after this news, detectives from the Kentucky side would state that there was no connection, it was just a lead that they were following up on. However, they conceded that both crime scenes shared some really rare similarities, but then the story kinda ended there. I get the feeling that the Delphi murderer wasn't involved in the Stevenson case as much as it seems that the Stevenson investigation uncovered something that the Delphi case could use. As far as the DNA goes, why hasn't that been used in genealogy testing like with the Golden State Killer? Detective Cox had an answer for this too. He claimed that this DNA was not suitable for that type of testing, which implies that the DNA had came from more than one person or that there wasn't enough of the sample to submit. As far as theories go, the police have remained tight-lipped, so there's not much to go on, but it is thought it was someone that the Stevensons knew because there was no sign of forced entry, and the Stevensons would have had to buzz any visitor in that came to their condo, meaning they wouldn't have likely done that for a stranger. The real key clue in this case is the weird scene itself, which the detectives have said contained a message, and that it seemed like it might be related to religion, so it's possible that it was someone who had a different spiritual belief than the Stevensons, but there's still that truck driver theory that hasn't been disproven either. Wetzel County, Jane Doe, West Virginia. On February 13th, 1983, an elderly couple going down Route 250 near Littleton, West Virginia, would notice what they thought was a mannequin on the side of the road. They would pull over to investigate closer. It's here they seen that it wasn't a mannequin at all. Instead, it was the nude body of a deceased woman. Upon arriving at the scene, detectives took note that the body had just been placed because there was no snow on the body, in spite of the fact that it had snowed on and off for the past 3 days. They followed tire tracks and footprints that indicated she died at a different area and was transported where she was found. Although she had not been sexually assaulted, foul play was obvious, as it was believed that she had been strangled or smothered. Authorities would later release info that they had 2 possible suspects in the case. One stocky white man in his 40s and roughly 5'10", 185 to 200 pounds, near the area and may have driven a 1978 or 1980 two-tone brown Chevy pickup with a lighter colored camper, while the other suspect was a man that would be arrested later for multiple murders. But until detectives can get victims' names, it's hard to prosecute. Investigators believe that she is probably from West Virginia, and it's possible she was seen in a bar in Wheeling, West Virginia shortly before, whereas some leads have mentioned that she was a prostitute in Pennsylvania. She had auburn-colored hair and scars on her abdomen, double ear piercings, was most likely not a hitchhiker, and just had an upper denture fitted 2 months before her death. There are 2 intriguing theories with this case. First was that it's connected to the Redhead murders, which was a series of murders of red-headed females between October 1978 and 1992, believed to have been committed by a serial killer in the states of Tennessee, Arkansas, Kentucky, Mississippi, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. Almost all of these victims had died of strangulation, but another interesting line of thought is that she might be connected to a religious community in West Virginia named Hare Krishna. It was a sect of Hinduism that was led by Kirtanananda Swami, and without going too deep into the rabbit hole, basically, 2 of the most vocal ex-members of that group started speaking out against Swami, and they would end up being murdered, which was done at the behest of Swami. Anyways, it's thought that Jane Doe could have been targeted by that group, or you may as well call them a cult, for speaking out against them or leaving. Lisa Shuttleworth, South Carolina. On the morning of September 4th, 2003, in Beach Island, South Carolina, Ryan Shuttleworth would get off at the bus stop after school, expecting his mother, Lisa Shuttleworth, to pick him up. Although she was not there, it did not initially worry him, and he would begin to walk to his house. When he arrived, he saw his mom's vehicle, along with the truck that a family friend had loaned to her, yet the house door was locked, and there was no sign of Lisa. As he was standing there on the front steps, the friend that had loaned the truck, 72-year-old Neil Durden, walked up. He had intended to simply pick his truck back up. He too expected Lisa to be home. Neil, not sure of what to do, waited a few minutes for Lisa to return. He thought that she had possibly went to visit a neighbor and lost track of time. He would eventually get tired of waiting, but didn't want to leave Ryan alone, so he took him to Lisa's parents and informed them of the situation. Lisa's mother had a key to the house and was worried that Lisa may be in need of assistance, so they immediately went over and let themselves in. They would go through the entire home, and there was no sign of Lisa. There was also nothing out of place, and no sign of a struggle. The only odd thing was a pot of tea sitting on top of the stove, with a napkin wrapped around the handle, which she no doubt used to take the kettle off when it was hot. And strangely, she left before any of the tea was ever poured. There wasn't even any cups out. The family began calling everyone they could think of, but no one had heard from her. Law enforcement was eventually called, and investigators quickly realized, after speaking to many of the people that knew her, that this was completely out of her character. But as far as clues went, there weren't many. One acquaintance recalled seeing Lisa around 8 a.m. that morning at a gas station. She said she was driving the truck that she had borrowed from Neil, but was sitting in it reading a newspaper while the truck sat at the gas pump. Her friend stated that it looked like she was waiting on someone. After that, another one of Lisa's friends would speak to her on the phone at 10 a.m. Lisa told this friend she was expecting a guest but did not elaborate. Investigators have never been able to figure out who this guest was, or if it was even a male or female. Other family members would report calling Lisa after 10 but never got an answer, so whatever happened occurred between 10 and 4. After a thorough search of the home, they were able to rule out that she had been harmed there, as well as nothing had been taken from the home, ruling out robbery. But one odd thing that stuck out was Lisa's driver's license and social security card were left behind at the home, but her purse was missing where she usually carried them at. Detectives ruled pretty early that foul play was involved, but the who and why remained elusive. Searches with bloodhounds and cadaver dogs took place, finding nothing. Lisa's family has stated they believe they know who is responsible. They just have no evidence, while detectives have remained tight-lipped on the matter, but it is assumed that she was probably lured outside by someone she trusted, who then abducted her. There have been several persons of interest since, which include a man she was having an affair with, and was rumored to be pregnant with his child. Other persons of interest were that of her ex-boyfriend, and that of her ex-husband, Jack Shuttleworth, and finally, Neil Durden himself, the man that loaned her the truck. According to her ex-husband, Neil was Lisa's, quote, sugar daddy, end quote. It should be noted, however, that he was her ex-husband, and he has been in and out of jail for years. Hey y'all, thanks for checking out this new series. If you enjoyed it, please let me know in the comment section below. If not, I'm sure I can find a way to use this content down the line.